They called it costume jewelry, a tacky piece of glass and metal that belonged in a garage sale, not around the neck of someone attending the most exclusive charity gala in Boston. My coworkers laughed behind cupped hands, whispering about how I clearly didn't understand the dress code. The woman who organized the event actually pulled me aside and suggested I might want to reconsider my accessories for future occasions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly known, was that the necklace they were mocking contained some of the rarest diamonds ever discovered. Stones so valuable that when the appraiser finally saw them, his hands actually trembled as he held the magnifying glass. This is the story of how their cruelty became my vindication, and how one night of humiliation changed everything I thought I knew about worth, value, and the people I had trusted most. The ballroom at the Fairmont Copley Plaza glittered like something out of a movie. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across marble floors, and women in designer gowns moved through the space like graceful shadows. I had spent 3 months preparing for this night, the annual Boston Children's Hospital Charity Gala. Not because I particularly enjoyed these events, but because attending was practically mandatory for anyone working at Henderson & Associates investment firm. My name is Rebecca Chen, though everyone at the firm just called me Becca. I was 28 years old, a mid-level financial analyst who had worked her way up from an entry-level position through sheer determination and 60-hour work weeks. I lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment in Somerville, drove a 7-year-old Honda Civic, and saved every penny I could, because I had learned early that financial security was something you built slowly, brick by brick. The dress I wore that night was navy blue, simple but elegant, purchased from Nordstrom Rack during their end-of-season sale. It had cost me $200, which felt like a fortune at the time, but I knew it was an investment in my career. What completed the outfit, however, was the necklace, a delicate piece with what appeared to be small, clear stones set in an intricate silver pattern. It had belonged to my grandmother, Elena Martinez, who had passed away 6 months earlier and left it to me in her will. Grandma Elena had been a woman of few words but deep convictions. She had immigrated to the United States from Spain in the 1950s, with nothing but a suitcase and an unwavering belief that hard work would eventually pay off. She cleaned office buildings at night and took in sewing during the day, slowly building a life for herself and eventually for my mother. When I was growing up, she would tell me stories about the old country while teaching me to embroider and showing me her small collection of jewelry, most of it simple, meaningful pieces that she had either brought from Spain or received as gifts over the years. The necklace had always been her favorite. She wore it to church every Sunday, to family gatherings, and on any occasion she deemed special enough. When I asked her about it as a child, she would smile mysteriously and say, "This necklace has stories, Mija. Someday you'll understand." I assumed she meant sentimental stories. Memories of my grandfather, perhaps, or moments from her youth in Valencia. After her funeral, when the lawyer read her will, I was surprised to learn that she had left me several items specifically: her wedding ring, a small collection of books in Spanish, and the necklace. My mother seemed puzzled by the choices, especially the necklace. "I never understood why she was so attached to that old thing," she had said, examining it briefly before handing it to me. "The stones look cloudy, and the setting is so old-fashioned. But she insisted it go to you." I had worn it only a few times since then, to job interviews for luck, to my cousin's wedding, and now to the charity gala. Something about wearing it made me feel connected to her strength, her resilience, her quiet dignity in the face of challenges. The evening started well enough. I arrived at the Fairmont at 7:30, checked my coat, and made my way into the cocktail reception. The firm had purchased a table for 8, and I knew I would be seated with my colleagues. Janet Morrison, the senior vice president who had hired me. Derek Williams, a fellow analyst who had started the same week I did. Lisa Park, one of the junior partners, and several others from our department. I spotted them near the bar, already deep in conversation about market trends and client portfolios. Janet saw me approaching and waved me over, but as I got closer, I noticed something in her expression change. Her eyes moved from my face down to my necklace, and her smile became strained. "Becca," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're trying to be encouraging about something they find concerning. You look lovely. That's an interesting necklace choice. Derek turned to look, and I caught the moment his expression shifted from neutral interest to barely concealed amusement. Wow, Becca, he said, that's quite a statement piece. Very vintage. Lisa joined the conversation, her eyes immediately drawn to my grandmother's necklace. Oh my, she said, and I could hear the judgment in her voice even though she was trying to sound kind. Is that from a costume jewelry collection? It's so unique. I felt my face flush, but I tried to keep my voice steady. It was my grandmother's, I said simply. She left it to me. That's sweet, Janet said, but her tone suggested she found it more concerning than sweet. It's wonderful that you want to honor her memory. Though for events like this, she gestured around the room, where women wore necklaces that caught the light with an unmistakable brilliance, diamonds and precious stones that probably cost more than my annual salary. Well, sometimes less is more, you know. Before I could respond, Margaret Thornton appeared at Janet's elbow. Margaret was the event coordinator, a woman in her 50s who moved through Boston's social circles with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her place in them. She wore a black Chanel gown and a diamond necklace that looked like it belonged in a museum. Janet, darling, Margaret said, air-kissing my boss on both cheeks. Thank you so much for your firm's generous contribution. We're going to raise so much money for the children tonight. Her eyes swept over our group, pausing when they reached me. I watched her gaze travel down to my necklace, and something almost like alarm flashed across her face. Oh, she said, and the single word carried more weight than a full sentence. That's quite a bold choice for tonight's event. Janet stepped in quickly, clearly embarrassed. Margaret, this is Rebecca Chen, one of our most promising analysts. Rebecca, this is Margaret Thornton. She's organized tonight's beautiful event. Margaret smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. How lovely to meet you, Rebecca. I hope you enjoy the evening. She paused, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if she were sharing a helpful secret. For future events like this, you might want to consider something a bit more understated. We find that sometimes accessories can be distracting from the cause we're here to support. I felt as if I had been slapped. The implication was clear. My grandmother's necklace was inappropriate. Tacky, a distraction. I nodded wordlessly, not trusting myself to speak without my voice shaking. As Margaret glided away to greet other guests, I became acutely aware of the glances being thrown in my direction. A group of women near the silent auction table were looking at me and whispering. Two men in expensive suits paused their conversation to stare. A server offering champagne gave me a sympathetic look that somehow made everything worse. Derek, perhaps sensing my discomfort, tried to change the subject. So, Becca, did you see the quarterly projections that came in today? But even as we talked about work, I could feel the judgment radiating from the people around us. The worst moment came when we were called to dinner. As we made our way to our table, I overheard a conversation between two women I didn't recognize, socialites who clearly moved in Margaret's circles. Did you see that girl's necklace? One of them was saying, not bothering to lower her voice. It looks like something from a street vendor. Glass and cheap metal. I know, her companion replied. Someone should have told her this wasn't a costume party. It's almost disrespectful, really, wearing something like that to an event like this. Maybe she doesn't know any better, the first woman said, and I could hear the pity in her voice, which was somehow worse than outright mockery. Some people just don't understand what's appropriate. I stopped walking. For a moment, I considered turning around and leaving. Walking out of the ballroom, getting my coat, and driving home to my small apartment where I could take off the dress and the necklace and pretend this night had never happened. But something held me in place. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the memory of my grandmother's voice telling me that the necklace had stories. At dinner, I was seated between Derek and a woman named Patricia Fitzgerald, who introduced herself as the wife of a prominent surgeon. Patricia was polite but distant, making conversation about the weather and the beautiful flowers on the tables. But I noticed how her eyes kept drifting to my necklace, and how she seemed to position herself so that fewer people would associate her with me. The meal was salmon with risotto, served on china that probably cost more per plate than I spent on groceries in a month. I ate mechanically, barely tasting the food, hyper-aware of every glance and whisper. When the auction began and Margaret took the stage to thank the evening's sponsors, I felt like I was watching everything through a fog of humiliation. "Tonight," Margaret said into the microphone, "we're here to support Boston Children's Hospital, and I'm so grateful to see so many of our community's most distinguished supporters in attendance. You all look absolutely beautiful tonight." Her eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on me before moving on. The message was clear. Most distinguished supporters was a category that didn't include someone wearing costume jewelry to a black tie event. As the evening wore on, the comments became more bold. During the auction, when I bid on a weekend getaway package, I heard someone behind me mutter, "Maybe she should spend her money on some real jewelry instead." When I excused myself to use the restroom, a group of women at the bar stopped talking as I passed, then resumed their conversation in hushed tones punctuated by barely suppressed laughter. The breaking point came during the dancing portion of the evening. Derek, trying to be kind, asked me to dance. As we moved onto the floor, I caught sight of Margaret talking to Janet near the edge of the dance floor. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw Margaret gesture in my direction, her expression serious and concerned. Janet nodded, looking embarrassed. When the song ended, Janet approached me. "Becca," she said quietly, "could I speak with you for a moment?" She led me to a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from the other guests. "Listen," she said, and I could tell she was uncomfortable. "Margaret mentioned that she's gotten a few comments about your necklace tonight. She's concerned that it might be sending the wrong message about our firm's understanding of appropriate professional presentation." I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Are you asking me to take it off?" Janet winced. "I'm just saying that for future events, it might be worth investing in something more conventional. I know it has sentimental value, but in our business, appearance matters. Clients notice these things. Partners notice these things." The implication was clear. My grandmother's necklace wasn't just inappropriate for the gala, it was potentially damaging to my career. I nodded slowly, feeling something crack open inside my chest. "I understand," I said quietly. But I didn't understand. I didn't understand how a piece of jewelry that had meant so much to a woman who had worked her entire life for every small comfort could be dismissed as costume jewelry. I didn't understand how people who claimed to be supporting children's charity could be so cruel to someone whose only crime was wearing a family heirloom. And I didn't understand why the necklace that had made my grandmother feel beautiful and dignified for decades could make me feel so small and ashamed. I made it through the rest of the evening, smiling when appropriate, applauding the auction winners, thanking Margaret for a lovely event. But inside, something had shifted. The humiliation burned, but underneath it was something else, a growing curiosity about the necklace that had provoked such strong reactions. As I drove home that night, still wearing the dress but having tucked the necklace inside my purse, I thought about my grandmother's mysterious smile whenever I had asked about it. "This necklace has stories, mija. Someday you'll understand." Maybe, I thought as I pulled into my apartment complex, it was time to find out what those stories were. What I didn't know then was that my grandmother's necklace would indeed have stories. Stories that would transform not just my understanding of the jewelry, but my understanding of worth, value, and the people who had spent an entire evening making me feel worthless because of what they assumed they knew. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Monday morning after the gala felt different from the moment I stepped into the Henderson & Associates building. The marble lobby that usually felt welcoming now seemed cold and judgmental, and I found myself unconsciously touching my throat where my grandmother's necklace wasn't. I had left it safely tucked away in my jewelry box at home. The elevator ride to the 14th floor stretched longer than usual. When the doors opened, I walked past the reception desk where Maria Santos usually greeted me with a warm smile. Today she glanced up briefly, nodded politely, and immediately returned to her computer screen. Something had shifted. My cubicle was in the northeast corner of the open floor plan, surrounded by Derek's workspace, Lisa's office, and about 15 other analysts and associates. Normally, Monday mornings were filled with casual chatter about weekend activities, shared coffee, and collaborative energy, as everyone eased into the work week. But as I settled into my chair and powered up my computer, I became aware of a subtle but unmistakable change in the atmosphere around me. Derek was at his desk, but instead of his usual cheerful, "Morning, Becca," he offered only a brief nod before burying himself in his monitors. When I walked to the coffee station, a small area with an expensive espresso machine that the firm had installed to boost morale, conversations seemed to pause as I approached and resume in hushed tones after I left. The first concrete sign that something was wrong came at 10:15, when I received an email marked Priority from Janet Morrison. The subject line read, "Professional Development Opportunity, please review." Rebecca, I hope you had a chance to reflect on Saturday evening's event. As we discussed, professional presentation is a crucial component of client relations and firm representation. I've identified some development resources that might be helpful as you continue to grow in your role. Attached, you'll find information about an executive presence workshop scheduled for next month, as well as some guidelines for appropriate attire at client-facing events. Please review these materials and let me know your thoughts. Additionally, I'd like to schedule a brief meeting this week to discuss your professional development goals and how we can ensure you're positioned for success in our industry. Best regards, Janet Morrison, Senior Vice President. I read the email 3 times, each pass making my stomach sink further. The attachments included a PDF titled Executive Presence, Dressing for Success in Financial Services, and registration information for a workshop called Professional Polish, Elevating Your Corporate Image. The workshop cost $1,200 and was scheduled for a full weekend. I stared at my screen, trying to process what was happening. Janet was essentially telling me that my appearance at the gala had been so inappropriate that it required professional intervention. The woman who had hired me, who had praised my analytical skills and work ethic for 3 years, was now questioning my ability to represent the firm based on one evening and one piece of jewelry. Around 11 o'clock, Lisa Park stopped by my desk. Lisa and I had always had a cordial relationship. Not quite friendship, but the kind of professional camaraderie that made long days more bearable. She had been one of the few people at the firm who seemed genuinely interested in mentoring younger employees. "Hey, Becca," she said, perching on the edge of my desk in a way that seemed casual but felt calculated. "How are you feeling after Saturday night?" "I'm fine," I said, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. Lisa nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer. "You know," she said, "I've been thinking about our conversation with Margaret Thornton. I hope you didn't take her comments too personally. She's just very particular about these events. They mean a lot to her." I looked up from my computer. I didn't realize wearing my grandmother's necklace would be such an issue. "Oh, of course not," Lisa said quickly. "I mean, it's sweet that you want to honor her memory. It's just that these charity events, they're really about the cause, you know? Sometimes accessories can accidentally draw attention away from what's important." There it was again, the gentle suggestion that my grandmother's necklace was somehow selfish, inappropriate, a distraction from more important things, as if the children we were supposed to be helping would somehow suffer because I had worn a family heirloom. "I understand," I said, using the same words I had used with Janet on Saturday night. But I didn't understand. What I was beginning to understand was that I had somehow crossed an invisible line, and everyone around me seemed to know exactly where that line was, except for me. The isolation became more pronounced as the week progressed. Derek, who usually collaborated with me on client reports, started working more closely with Amanda Rodriguez, another analyst who had been hired 6 months after me. When I suggested grabbing lunch together on Tuesday, something we had done regularly for months, he claimed he was too busy with a new project. In the weekly department meeting on Wednesday, Janet announced that Amanda would be taking the lead on the Morrison Industries account, a significant client that I had been developing a relationship with for the past year. "We want to give Amanda more exposure to high-profile clients," Janet explained, not meeting my eyes. "It's important for junior team members to get diverse experience." I raised my hand. "I'd be happy to collaborate on the Morrison account," I said. "I've been working with them since last March, and I think continuity might be valuable." "That's thoughtful of you, Rebecca," Janet replied, using my full name in a way that felt formal and distant. "But we think a fresh perspective might be beneficial. You can focus on some of our smaller accounts for now." Smaller accounts. The message was clear. I was being moved away from the clients and projects that mattered, relegated to the work that would keep me busy but not visible. The whispers followed me everywhere. In the break room, conversations stopped when I entered. In the bathroom, I overheard two women from the marketing department discussing, quote, that girl from the gala who wore the fake jewelry. When I attended a client presentation on Thursday, I noticed how Margaret Thornton, who was apparently a friend of the client, made a point of introducing everyone on our team except me. By Friday, I felt like I was working in a bubble. My emails were answered with formal politeness but no warmth. My suggestions in meetings were acknowledged but not discussed. My presence seemed to make people uncomfortable, as if I were a reminder of some social mistake they didn't want to think about. The most painful moment came when I overheard Janet on a phone call with someone I assumed was another senior executive. I had stayed late to finish a report, and most of the office was empty except for a few people working overtime. Janet's office door was slightly ajar, and her voice carried across the quiet floor. "I'm telling you, Robert, it was mortifying," she was saying. Margaret Thornton practically lectured me about the importance of coaching our people on appropriate presentation. She made it clear that future invitations might depend on our team's ability to represent the firm appropriately. There was a pause as she listened to the response. "No, she's a good analyst," Janet continued. "Her work is solid. But this industry is about relationships as much as numbers, and if she can't read a room or understand basic social expectations..." Another pause. "I think we need to consider whether she's really partner track material, Maybe she'd be happier in a more back-office role." I stood frozen in the hallway, holding the report I had planned to drop off on her desk. Partner track. For 3 years, I had worked toward that goal, believing that my performance and dedication would eventually earn me a place among the firm's leadership. Now I was hearing that a single evening, a single accessory, might derail everything I had been building. I walked back to my desk, left the report in my outbox, and gathered my things. As I waited for the elevator, I thought about my grandmother's words. "This necklace has stories, Mija." Maybe it was time to find out what those stories really were. That weekend, I drove to my mother's house in Brookline, the small 2-bedroom ranch where I had grown up, and where my grandmother had spent her final years. My mother, Carmen Chen Martinez, had inherited my father's pragmatism and my grandmother's quiet strength, but she had never been particularly interested in family history or sentimental objects. "Mom," I said as we sat in her kitchen drinking coffee, "tell me about Grandma's necklace, the one she left me." My mother looked puzzled. "What do you want to know? It's just an old piece of jewelry. She was attached to it, but honestly, I never understood why." "Did she ever tell you where it came from? How she got it?" Carmen shrugged. "She said it was from Spain, from her family, but you know how she was about talking about the past. She preferred to focus on the present." I pressed further. "Did she ever mention it being valuable or special in some way?" "Valuable?" My mother laughed, but not unkindly. "Misha, your grandmother cleaned office buildings for 30 years. If that necklace had been valuable, don't you think she would have sold it when times were hard? She kept it because it reminded her of home, not because it was worth anything." But as I drove back to my apartment that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. My grandmother had been a practical woman, yes, but she had also been fiercely protective of the things that mattered to her. She had worked multiple jobs to ensure that my mother could go to college, had saved every penny to help with my education, had been strategic and careful about every financial decision she made. Would such a woman really have treasured a piece of costume jewelry for 60 years? That night, I took the necklace out of my jewelry box and examined it more closely than I ever had before. Under the bright light of my desk lamp, I could see that the setting was more intricate than I had realized. Tiny details carved into the metal, delicate work that spoke of craftsmanship rather than mass production. The stones, which everyone had dismissed as glass, had a clarity and brilliance that seemed unusual for fake gems. On an impulse, I took several photos of the necklace with my phone, capturing different angles and details. Then I did something I probably should have done years earlier. I started researching. I began with basic searches about Spanish jewelry from the 1950s, then moved to more specific queries about antique necklaces and vintage gemstones. What I found was a world I had never known existed. A complex landscape of appraisals and authentications, of hidden value and overlooked treasures. And slowly, as I read article after article about inherited jewelry and family heirlooms, I began to suspect that my grandmother's mysterious smile had been hiding something much bigger than sentimental memories. The necklace that had made me a target of mockery and professional humiliation might not have been what anyone, including me, had assumed it was. My research consumed the entire weekend. What had started as idle curiosity on Friday night had become an obsession by Sunday afternoon. I had filled 3 notebook pages with information about Spanish jewelry makers, antique appraisal techniques, and the history of diamond cutting in Europe during the early 20th century. The more I learned, the more questions arose. According to my preliminary research, authentic vintage jewelry from Spain often featured specific characteristics that I was beginning to recognize in my grandmother's necklace. The setting appeared to be handcrafted rather than machine-made, with tiny imperfections that actually indicated superior artisanship. The metal had a patina that suggested genuine silver rather than the cheap alloys used in costume jewelry. But it was the stones themselves that intrigued me most. Every article one read emphasized that determining the authenticity of vintage gems required professional assessment. The naked eye, even a trained one, couldn't distinguish between high-quality cubic zirconia and genuine diamonds, especially in pieces from the 1940s and 1950s, when synthetic alternatives were becoming increasingly sophisticated. On Monday morning, I made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just a week earlier. Instead of going directly to work, I drove to Newbury Street, Boston's most prestigious shopping district, where I had researched several high-end jewelry stores that specialized in antique pieces and estate appraisals. I had called ahead to make an appointment at Whitmore & Associates Fine Jewelry, a family-owned business that had been operating in Boston since 1923. The woman who answered the phone, Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, had a gentle voice with a slight accent that I couldn't place. When I explained that I had inherited a piece that I wanted to have evaluated, she had immediately suggested a consultation. "Many people are surprised by what they inherit," she had said. "Family pieces often carry more history than we realize." The shop occupied the ground floor of a narrow brownstone building, its windows displaying carefully curated collections of engagement rings, vintage brooches, and estate jewelry. A small bronze plaque beside the door read, "Whitmore & Associates, Certified Gemologists and Appraisers, since 1923. I pushed open the heavy glass door, causing a small bell to chime softly. The interior was nothing like the bright, sterile jewelry stores in shopping malls. Rich burgundy carpeting covered the floors, and warm lighting illuminated glass cases filled with pieces that looked like they belonged in museums. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and old wood. "You must be Miss Chen," said a voice from behind the main counter. I turned to see a woman in her 60s approaching me, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and her eyes bright with genuine interest. "I'm Catherine Whitmore. Thank you for calling ahead." Mrs. Whitmore led me to a small consultation room in the back of the shop, where a large desk was equipped with various magnifying devices, measuring tools, and what appeared to be high-tech testing equipment. The walls were lined with reference books, certification documents, and photographs of notable pieces the shop had appraised over the decades. "Now then," she said, settling into her chair across from me, "what do we have here?" I carefully removed the necklace from its protective pouch and placed it on the velvet-lined tray she had provided. Mrs. Whitmore's expression didn't change initially, but I noticed how her posture shifted slightly as she leaned forward to examine the piece more closely. "May I?" she asked, reaching for a jeweler's loupe. I nodded, watching as she lifted the necklace with practiced hands. What followed was 15 minutes of intense examination. She studied the setting under various magnifications, tested the metal with small tools I didn't recognize, and examined each stone individually with equipment that looked like miniature microscopes. Throughout this process, she made occasional soft sounds, and interesting, and once, very quietly, "Well, I'll be damned." But she didn't share her observations with me. maintaining the kind of professional composure that comes from decades of experience with valuable objects. Finally, she set down her loupe and looked at me directly. "Miss Chen," she said, "before we discuss what I'm seeing here, I need to ask you some questions about this piece's provenance. Where did you say it came from?" "My grandmother," I replied. "She inherited it from Spain and brought it with her when she immigrated in the 1950s. It was left to me when she passed away 6 months ago." Mrs. Whitmore nodded thoughtfully. "And your grandmother's name was?" "Elena Martinez. She was from Valencia originally, but she lived in the United States for over 60 years. Something flickered in Mrs. Whitmore's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or surprise. She excused herself and disappeared into what I assumed was a back office, returning a few minutes later with a thick leather-bound ledger and a manila folder. "Miss Chen," she said, settling back into her chair, "I'm going to share something with you that may come as quite a shock. This necklace, I've seen it before." My heart started beating faster. "What do you mean?" "In 1987, a woman named Elena Martinez brought this exact piece to my father for an appraisal. I was working as his apprentice at the time, and I remember the appointment clearly because of what he discovered." She opened the ledger to a page marked with a red ribbon. "According to our records, your grandmother was exploring the possibility of selling this necklace to help pay for her daughter's college tuition." I felt the blood drain from my face. My mother had attended Boston University in the late 1980s, graduating with a degree in education that had allowed her to become a teacher. I had always known that money had been tight during those years, that my grandmother had worked extra shifts and taken on additional sewing projects to help with expenses. "What happened?" I asked. Mrs. Whitmore smiled, but there was something sad in her expression. "My father completed the appraisal and informed your grandmother that the necklace was worth significantly more than she had anticipated. When he told her the value, she became very quiet. Then she asked him to put the appraisal in writing, sealed it in an envelope, and told him she had decided not to sell after all." She opened the manila folder and withdrew a yellowed envelope with Elena Martinez Confidential Appraisal, written in faded ink across the front. "She asked my father to keep this sealed until either she returned to claim it or someone from her family came asking about the piece. She said, and I remember this clearly, someday my granddaughter will need to know what this really is. But not yet. She needs to earn her strength first." My hands were shaking as Mrs. Whitmore held the envelope. "Are you saying she knew it was valuable?" "Miss Chen, your grandmother didn't just know it was valuable. According to this appraisal, which I'm going to verify with current market conditions, this necklace contains 8 rare pink diamonds that were likely cut in Valencia in the 1920s. These aren't just any diamonds. They're a specific type called Argyle pink diamonds, which are among the rarest gemstones in the world." The room seemed to spin around me. "That's impossible," I whispered. "She was a cleaning woman. She lived paycheck to paycheck. If the necklace was valuable, why didn't she?" "Because," Mrs. Whitmore said gently, "some things are worth more than money. And sometimes, the right time to reveal a truth isn't when you need money most. It's when you need strength most." She carefully opened the envelope and withdrew several pages of documentation. The first page was the original appraisal, dated September 15, 1987, and signed by Harold Whitmore, master gemologist. The estimated value, even in $1,987, was breathtaking. "Now," Mrs. Whitmore continued, "I'll need to conduct a new appraisal using current equipment and market values. Diamond prices have changed significantly since 1987, especially for rare stones like these. But based on what I'm seeing," she paused, studying the necklace again, "Miss Chen, you may be looking at a piece worth several $100,000. I couldn't speak. The necklace that had made me a laughingstock at the charity gala, that had threatened my career and isolated me from my colleagues, that everyone had dismissed as cheap costume jewelry, might be worth more than most people earned in 5 years. "There's something else," Mrs. Whitmore said, referring to another document in the folder. "Your grandmother left specific instructions about what to do if anyone from her family ever came inquiring about this piece. She handed me a handwritten note in my grandmother's familiar script. 'If my granddaughter Rebecca comes asking about the necklace, please tell her the whole truth. Not just about the stones, but about why I kept them hidden.' She will understand when she is ready to understand. Tell her that real value isn't always visible to people who only know how to see surfaces. Tell her that I wore this necklace every Sunday not because it was expensive, but because it reminded me that I carried something precious that the world couldn't touch. Tell her that sometimes the most valuable things we own are the ones other people try to convince us are worthless. And tell her that I always knew she would be strong enough to handle this knowledge when the time was right. With love and pride, Elena Martinez. I sat in that consultation room for another hour while Mrs. Whitmore walked me through the preliminary findings of her examination. The necklace contained 8 pink diamonds, each between 0.5 carat and 2 carats, set in a platinum mounting that had been crafted by a master jeweler in Valencia sometime between 1920 and 1930. The style was consistent with Spanish aristocratic jewelry from that period, suggesting that the piece had belonged to a wealthy family before somehow making its way to my grandmother. How it came to your grandmother is a story I can't tell you, Mrs. Whitmore explained. That's family history that died with her. But what I can tell you is that these stones are genuine, rare, and extraordinarily valuable. She scheduled a full formal appraisal for the following week, explaining that she would need to photograph each stone individually, conduct detailed measurements, and research comparable sales to establish current market value. The process would take several days and cost $500. But she assured me that if the necklace proved to be as valuable as she suspected, the appraisal fee would be insignificant compared to what I would learn. As I drove home that afternoon, I thought about the past week of humiliation and isolation at work. I thought about Margaret Thornton's condescending advice and Janet's concerns about my professional development. I thought about Derek's sudden distance and Lisa's patronizing explanations about drawing attention away from important causes. They had all been so certain that they knew what they were looking at. They had judged the necklace, and by extension, me, based on their assumptions about worth and value and social appropriateness. They had dismissed both the jewelry and the woman wearing it as inferior, inappropriate, embarrassing. But none of them had bothered to look closer. None of them had considered that their assumptions might be wrong. None of them had imagined that the cheap costume jewelry they had mocked might be worth more than their cars, their designer handbags, their condescending charity donations combined. I thought about my grandmother, wearing this necklace to church every Sunday, knowing exactly what she carried but choosing to let the world see only what it expected to see. She had understood something that I was just beginning to grasp, that real power sometimes comes from being underestimated. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I made a decision. I would wait for the formal appraisal results before telling anyone what I had learned. But when the truth finally came out, and I was becoming more certain that it would, I wanted to be very strategic about how I shared that information. The people who had humiliated me would learn exactly how wrong they had been, but they would learn it on my terms, in my timing, in a way that would ensure they never forgot the lesson. The week between my consultation with Mrs. Whitmore and the formal appraisal appointment stretched like an eternity. Every morning, I walked into Henderson & Associates, knowing something my colleagues didn't know, carrying a secret that grew heavier and more powerful with each passing day. The isolation that had felt crushing just a week earlier now felt like armor, protective, strategic, necessary. I had always been a planner, someone who thought through decisions carefully and considered all possible outcomes before acting. It was what made me good at financial analysis, and it was what would make me effective now. If the formal appraisal confirmed what Mrs. Whitmore suspected, I would need to be very careful about how I handled the revelation. This wasn't just about proving that my grandmother's necklace was valuable. It was about exposing the cruelty and superficial judgment that had nearly derailed my career. The dynamics at work continued to deteriorate, but now I observed them with a different kind of attention. I started keeping detailed notes about every interaction, every slight, every assumption that my colleagues made about my background, my judgment, and my place in their world. On Tuesday morning, I overheard Amanda Rodriguez talking to Derek near the coffee station. They didn't see me approaching from the copy room, and their voices carried clearly across the open floor plan. I still can't believe she wore that necklace to the Thornton gala, Amanda was saying, stirring sugar into her latte. I mean, didn't anyone ever teach her about reading a room? Derek laughed, but it sounded uncomfortable. Janet thinks she might need some kind of coaching. Professional development for people who didn't grow up understanding these social expectations. It's not even about money, Amanda continued. You can get appropriate jewelry at Target. She chose to wear something that looked like it came from a carnival prize booth to a charity event. It's like she wanted to embarrass the firm. I stayed hidden behind the copy machine until they moved away, but I wrote down every word they had said in the small notebook I had started carrying. Amanda's comment about people who didn't grow up understanding social expectations was particularly interesting. She had made assumptions about my background, my education, my family's socioeconomic status, all based on a single piece of jewelry. What Amanda didn't know was that I had grown up in a middle-class household with parents who had emphasized education and hard work. What she didn't know was that I had graduated summa cum laude from Boston College with a double major in finance and economics. What she didn't know was that my inappropriate necklace might be worth more than her entire annual salary. But I didn't correct her assumptions. Instead, I let them grow. On Wednesday, Janet Morrison called me into her office for the professional development meeting she had mentioned in her email. Her office was corner space, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Common. The walls were decorated with her diplomas from Harvard Business School, framed photos of her with various clients, and a small collection of awards from industry organizations. Rebecca, she said, gesturing for me to take a seat in one of the leather chairs across from her desk, I wanted to follow up on our conversation about Saturday's event. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, and waited for her to continue. I've given this a lot of thought, Janet said, and I want you to know that I'm committed to helping you succeed here. You're a talented analyst, and your work has been consistently strong. But in our industry, technical skills are only part of the equation. She pulled out a manila folder and placed it on the desk between us. I've registered you for the executive presence workshop I mentioned, and I've also arranged for you to work with Eleanor Hartwell, one of Boston's premier image consultants. Eleanor has helped several of our female associates develop the kind of polished presentation that clients expect. The image consultant was clearly expensive. Her website, which Janet showed me on her tablet, featured testimonials from executives at major corporations and a pricing structure that started at $3,000 for a basic consultation package. Now, I know this represents a significant investment, Janet continued, but the firm is willing to cover half the cost as part of your professional development budget. We see this as an investment in your future here. I looked at the folder, at the workshop materials, at the photograph of Eleanor Hartwell in her perfectly tailored suit and understated jewelry. Everything about this conversation was designed to help me understand that I had failed some crucial test, that my appearance at the gala had been so egregiously inappropriate that it required professional intervention. What specifically about my presentation was problematic? I asked. Janet seemed surprised by the directness of my question. Well, she said, it's not any one thing specifically. It's more about developing an instinct for what's appropriate in different settings. Understanding how our choices reflect not just on ourselves, but on the organization we represent. Are you referring to my necklace? Among other things, yes. Janet's voice became gentler, as if she were delivering difficult news to someone she cared about. Rebecca, I need you to understand that in our client base, people notice details. They make judgments based on those details. When Margaret Thornton pulls me aside to discuss a team member's appearance, that affects the firm's relationship with one of Boston's most influential philanthropists. I nodded slowly. I see. So my grandmother's necklace was inappropriate because it appeared inexpensive. Not inappropriate, Janet corrected quickly. Just not quite right for that particular venue. These events have unspoken dress codes, and part of professional development is learning to navigate those expectations. What Janet didn't realize was that she was giving me exactly the information I needed. She was confirming that the entire judgment against me had been based on appearance, on assumptions, on the perceived value of what I was wearing, rather than any actual inappropriate behavior on my part. I appreciate the firm's willingness to invest in my development, I said carefully. May I have some time to review these materials before making a decision? Of course, Janet said, clearly relieved that I was being cooperative. Take all the time you need. But I do hope you'll take advantage of these opportunities. I'd hate to see your career progress limited by something so easily addressable. I left her office with the folder under my arm and a new clarity about exactly how my colleagues viewed me. They saw someone who needed fixing, someone whose judgment was questionable, someone whose background hadn't prepared her for their world of charity galas and unspoken rules. What they didn't see was someone who was about to prove that their assumptions about value, about jewelry, about people, about worth itself, were not just wrong, but spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. That afternoon, I made several strategic decisions. First, I would accept the firm's offer to pay for half of the image consultant's fee, not because I believed I needed fixing, but because it would demonstrate my apparent willingness to address their concerns. Second, I would continue to be cooperative and professional in all my interactions, giving them no reason to question my attitude or work ethic. Third, I would document everything, every conversation, every slight, every assumption, so that when the time came to reveal the truth, I would have a complete record of exactly how they had treated me. But most importantly, I would wait. I would wait for the formal appraisal results, and I would wait for the perfect moment to share what I had learned. The opportunity to test my new strategy came on Thursday, when the entire department was invited to a client lunch at the Union Club, one of Boston's most exclusive private clubs. The client was Robert Kingsley, heir to a shipping fortune, and one of the firm's largest individual accounts. I wore a conservative black suit, simple pearl earrings, and no necklace at all. As we walked through the club's oak-paneled halls, past portraits of distinguished members, and displays of historical artifacts, I noticed how differently my colleagues treated me. Derek actually complimented my outfit. Lisa mentioned that I looked much more polished. Even Janet seemed more relaxed in my presence. During lunch, Mr. Kingsley shared stories about his family's collection of maritime artifacts and antique jewelry. My great-grandmother had quite an eye for valuable pieces, he said, cutting into his beef tenderloin. She could spot authentic gems from across a room. Said it was a gift, being able to see value that other people missed. That's fascinating, Derek said. I wouldn't know a real diamond from a fake one if my life depended on it. Several people at the table laughed, including Janet. Most of us can't, she said. That's why we rely on experts and certificates, although sometimes even the experts get fooled. I remained quiet during this exchange, but I filed away every word. Here were people who freely admitted they couldn't distinguish valuable jewelry from costume pieces, yet they had been comfortable judging and humiliating me based on their uninformed assumptions. After lunch, as we walked back to the office, Amanda fell into step beside me. You seem different this week, she said. More focused, I guess. Less rattled by everything. What do you mean? I asked. Last week you seemed really upset about the feedback from the gala. I was worried you might be taking it too personally. She paused. I'm glad to see you're handling it well. It shows maturity. Maturity? As if accepting humiliation and unfair treatment was a sign of professional growth, rather than a survival strategy. I'm learning a lot, I told her, which was absolutely true. That evening, I had dinner with my college roommate, Sarah Mitchell, who now worked as a marketing director for a tech startup in Cambridge. Sarah had always been the kind of friend who told you exactly what she thought, whether you wanted to hear it or not. Wait, she said, setting down her wine glass. Let me get this straight. They're making you take classes because you wore your grandmother's necklace to a charity event? They're calling it professional development, I said. They think I need coaching on appropriate presentation. Sarah stared at me. Becca, that's insane. You've been working there for 3 years. You've never had any problems with clients or presentation before. One piece of jewelry and suddenly you need professional coaching? Apparently so. And nobody bothered to ask you about the necklace? Nobody considered that maybe it had sentimental value? Or that there might be more to the story? I thought about Mrs. Whitmore's preliminary assessment, about the envelope my grandmother had left, about the formal appraisal scheduled for the following week. No, I said. Nobody asked. Sarah shook her head. You know what I think? I think they're showing you exactly who they really are. And maybe it's time you started paying attention. She was right, but not in the way she intended. My colleagues were showing me who they really were. People who made judgments based on surfaces, who valued appearance over substance, who were comfortable humiliating someone rather than questioning their own assumptions. But they were also showing me something else: how easy it was to manipulate people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. Over the weekend, I prepared for what I had started thinking of as the revelation. I practiced different scenarios in my mind, imagining how various people would react when they learned the truth about my grandmother's necklace. I thought about timing, about audience, about maximum impact. I also started researching something else: employment law, specifically regarding hostile work environments and discrimination based on perceived socioeconomic status. What I learned was that while my colleagues' behavior might not constitute illegal discrimination, it certainly revealed the kind of bias and prejudice that most companies worked hard to avoid. On Sunday evening, I received the formal appraisal appointment confirmation from Mrs. Whitmore, scheduled for Tuesday at 2 o'clock. In just 48 hours, I would know exactly how valuable my grandmother's necklace really was. But more than that, I would know exactly how much my colleagues had revealed about themselves when they had dismissed something precious as worthless, and exactly how much power that knowledge would give me when I decided what to do next. The game was about to change completely, and this time, I would be the one controlling how it was played. Tuesday arrived with an unseasonable chill for October in Boston. I had taken the afternoon off work, telling Janet I had a medical appointment, which wasn't entirely untrue, considering how my heart rate had been elevated for days in anticipation of the formal appraisal. I spent the morning at my desk, mechanically reviewing quarterly reports while my mind wandered to Newbury Street and the answers waiting for me there. At 1:30, I gathered my things and headed for the elevator. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of Derek and Amanda in animated conversation near the windows, probably discussing the Morrison Industries presentation that should have been mine. 6 months ago, being excluded from that conversation would have devastated me. Now it felt like watching actors in a play I no longer wanted to be part of. The October air was crisp as I walked down Newbury Street, past boutiques and cafes filled with people who move through the world with the confidence that comes from never questioning your place in it. I wondered how many of them carried secrets, how many possessed things that would surprise the people who thought they knew them. Mrs. Whitmore was waiting for me when I arrived at the shop, and I could sense an energy about her that hadn't been there during our first meeting. She led me to the consultation room, but this time the desk was covered with additional equipment, high-powered microscopes, digital scales, and several reference books that looked thick and technical. "Miss Chen," she said, settling into her chair, "I've completed the formal assessment, and I have quite a bit to share with you. But before we discuss my findings, I want to tell you something about the research I've done on your grandmother's necklace." She opened a thick file folder and withdrew several documents. After our last meeting, I contacted a colleague of mine in Madrid who specializes in Spanish estate jewelry from the early 20th century. I sent him photographs of your necklace and asked if he could provide any historical context. Mrs. Whitmore handed me a printed email with attached photographs. What he told me adds a remarkable layer to this story. According to his research, this necklace was originally created by master jeweler Alejandro Vega in Valencia in 1928. Vega was known for working exclusively with wealthy Spanish families, creating one-of-a-kind pieces using the finest materials available. She pointed to one of the photographs, a close-up of the necklace's clasp mechanism. "See these tiny markings? That's Vega's signature stamp. My colleague says he's only seen this stamp on a handful of pieces, all of which were commissioned by aristocratic families before the Spanish Civil War." I studied the photograph, seeing details I had never noticed before. How did my grandmother end up with something like this? That's the question, isn't it? Mrs. Whitmore said. Your grandmother immigrated in the 1950s, more than 20 years after this piece was created. How a cleaning woman came to possess a necklace originally made for Spanish aristocracy. Well, that's a family story that may never be fully known. She set aside the historical documentation and picked up a different set of papers. But what I can tell you definitively is what this necklace is worth in today's market. Mrs. Whitmore placed a formal appraisal certificate in front of me. The letterhead read, Whitmore and Associates, Certified Gemological Appraisal, and was dated October 15th, just 3 days ago. My eyes moved down the page, past technical descriptions of metal composition and stone characteristics, until I reached the bottom line. Current fair market value, $485,000. I stared at the number, reading it again and again as if the digits might rearrange themselves into something more believable. $485,000. For the necklace that Margaret Thornton had suggested was inappropriate for a charity gala. For the jewelry that my colleagues had dismissed as costume pieces from a garage sale. The pink diamonds are particularly rare, Mrs. Whitmore explained. 3 of them are what gemologists call fancy vivid pink, which is the highest color grade for pink diamonds. The other 5 are fancy intense pink. Both grades are extremely rare, but vivid pink diamonds are among the most valuable gemstones in the world. She showed me detailed photographs of each stone, magnified to reveal their internal structure and color saturation. Pink diamonds get their color from a rare distortion in the crystal lattice during formation. They're found primarily in the Argyle mine in Australia, but these stones show characteristics consistent with older European cutting techniques. It's possible they were mined elsewhere and cut in Spain during the 1920s. I felt dizzy. The necklace I had worn to church as a child, that my grandmother had put on every Sunday for 60 years, that had made her feel beautiful and connected to her past, contained stones that were literally 1 in a million. There's something else, Mrs. Whitmore continued. When I examined the setting more closely, I found something interesting hidden in the metalwork. She handed me a magnifying glass and pointed to a specific area on the necklace's back panel. Look here, near the main clasp. Under magnification, I could see tiny letters engraved in the metal. So small they were barely visible to the naked eye. The engraving read, Para mi querida Elena, con amor eterno, A.M. For my beloved Elena, with eternal love, A.M., Mrs. Whitmore translated. This wasn't just a piece owned by your grandmother, Miss Chen. This was a piece made specifically for her. The implications hit me like a physical force. My grandmother hadn't just inherited this necklace or acquired it by chance. Someone had commissioned master jeweler Alejandro Vega to create this extraordinary piece specifically for Elena Martinez. Someone with enough wealth to afford rare pink diamonds had loved my grandmother, enough to give her something that would be worth nearly $500,000 90 years later. Do you have any idea who A.M. might have been? Mrs. Whitmore asked gently. I shook my head, but my mind was racing through family stories, trying to remember any mention of someone with those initials from my grandmother's life in Spain. She had been private about her past, always more interested in talking about the present and future than dwelling on memories. There's one more thing, Mrs. Whitmore said. I've prepared a second document for you, an insurance appraisal. This estimates what it would cost to replace the necklace if it were lost or stolen. Given the rarity of the stones and the historical significance of the piece, the replacement value is actually higher than the fair market value. She handed me another certificate. The replacement value was listed as $650,000. I sat in that consultation room for another 30 minutes, while Mrs. Whitmore explained the technical details of the appraisal, the certification process, and the recommendations for insuring such a valuable piece. But my mind kept drifting to the faces of my colleagues, to Margaret Thornton's condescending smile, to Amanda's comments about people who didn't understand social expectations. They had been so certain, so confident in their ability to assess value, to determine what belonged in their world and what didn't. They had looked at my grandmother's necklace and seen cheap glass and metal. They had looked at me and seen someone who needed coaching. Someone who didn't understand their sophisticated social rules. None of them had considered that they might be wrong. None of them had imagined that the inappropriate jewelry they had mocked might be worth more than most of their annual salaries. None of them had entertained the possibility that the woman they were so eager to educate might be wearing something they couldn't afford, even if they pooled their resources. As I walked back to my car carrying the appraisal certificates in a protective envelope, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. For the first time since the charity gala, I wasn't angry or humiliated or confused. I was focused. I had a choice to make. I could return to work tomorrow, schedule the appointment with Eleanor Hartwell, attend the executive presence workshop, and pretend that my colleagues' judgment had been reasonable and helpful. I could apologize for my inappropriate presentation and demonstrate my gratitude for their guidance. or I could do something else entirely. That evening, I sat in my apartment with the appraisal certificate spread across my kitchen table. I thought about my grandmother, wearing this extraordinary necklace to clean office buildings at night, carrying nearly $500,000 worth of rare diamonds while earning minimum wage. I thought about the strength it must have taken to keep such a secret, to let people see only what they expected to see, while holding on to something precious that nobody could touch. I thought about the note she had left with Mrs. Whitmore. Real value isn't always visible to people who only know how to see surfaces. And I realized that my grandmother had been teaching me something long before I was ready to understand it. She had been showing me how to carry worth that wasn't dependent on other people's recognition, how to possess something valuable without needing to prove it to anyone else. But she had also been preparing me for this moment, when I would need to decide whether to continue hiding in plain sight or to reveal what I carried. I made my decision that night, sitting alone in my kitchen with the proof of what my grandmother's necklace really was. I would not schedule the appointment with Eleanor Hartwell. I would not attend the executive presence workshop. I would not apologize for wearing something inappropriate to the charity gala. Instead, I would wait. I would let my colleagues continue making assumptions, continue treating me as someone who needed their guidance and correction. I would let them believe they understood my value, my background, my place in their world. And when the time was right, when I had gathered enough evidence of their treatment, when the moment would have maximum impact, I would show them exactly how wrong they had been about everything. The silence I had been living in would become the most powerful weapon I had ever wielded. And just like my grandmother before me, I would choose very carefully when to break it. 3 weeks passed after the formal appraisal, and I maintained my strategy of careful silence. I showed up to work each day, completed my assignments with my usual precision, and observed my colleagues with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a fascinating but alien culture. The insurance policy I had taken out on the necklace sat in my desk drawer at home, a reminder of the secret I carried that grew more powerful with each passing day. The shift in workplace dynamics had solidified into a new normal. I had been effectively relegated to lower-profile accounts, excluded from major client presentations, and treated with the kind of polite condescension reserved for employees who were being managed out of important roles. But what my colleagues interpreted as my acceptance of their judgment was actually something else entirely: patience. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: my grandmother's estate lawyer. Thomas Brennan had handled Elena Martinez's will and the distribution of her modest assets. He was a soft-spoken man in his 70s who had worked with immigrant families for most of his career, helping them navigate American legal systems and ensure their children inherited whatever small treasures they had managed to accumulate. I had met him only once, during the formal reading of my grandmother's will 6 months earlier. On a Thursday morning in early November, I received a call from his office while I was reviewing client portfolios. His secretary, Mrs. Patterson, spoke with the careful diction of someone who had been answering legal phones for decades. "Miss Chen, Mr. Brennan would like to schedule an appointment with you regarding your grandmother's estate. There have been some additional documents discovered that require your attention." Additional documents. My heart rate increased as I arranged to meet him the following afternoon. What could have been overlooked in my grandmother's simple estate? Her will had been straightforward: a few $1,000s in savings, some personal effects, and the necklace that had already turned my world upside down. Mr. Brennan's office was located in a converted brownstone in Back Bay, the kind of building where lawyers who specialized in family law and estate planning had been practicing for generations. The waiting room smelled like old books and furniture polish, and the walls were lined with photographs of Boston from the early 20th century. "Miss Chen," Mr. Brennan said, emerging from his office to greet me. "Thank you for coming in. I'm sorry for the mysterious phone call, but what I need to share with you is rather unusual." He led me into his office, where afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows and illuminated shelves packed with legal volumes and family photographs. On his desk was a manila envelope marked Elena Martinez, Supplemental Estate Materials, in his careful handwriting. "About 2 weeks ago," he began, settling into his leather chair, "I received a call from a storage facility in Somerville. Apparently, your grandmother had been renting a small unit there for the past 15 years. The rental had been automatically deducted from her bank account each month, but after her death, the payments stopped. The facility has a policy of holding units for 6 months after non-payment before auctioning the contents. I stared at him. My grandmother had rented a storage unit? In all the conversations we had shared over the years, she had never mentioned storing anything outside of her small apartment. The facility contacted me because my office was listed as the emergency contact on her rental agreement, Mr. Brennan continued. When I went to examine the contents, I found several boxes of documents and personal items that weren't included in the initial estate inventory. He opened the manila envelope and withdrew a thick stack of papers. Some of these documents are in Spanish, and some appear to be quite old, but there are several items that specifically reference the necklace you inherited, and I believe you should see them. The first document he handed me was a letter written in my grandmother's careful script, dated just 6 months before her death. It was addressed to me. My dearest Rebecca, if you are reading this letter, it means that you have begun asking questions about the necklace I left you. I hoped you would. I hoped that when the time was right, you would want to understand not just what it is, but why I kept its secrets for so long. The necklace was a gift from someone I loved very much, long before I came to America. His name was Antonio Mendoza, and he was the heir to one of Valencia's oldest textile fortunes. We met in 1947, when I was 22 and working as a seamstress in his family's factory. He was supposed to marry someone chosen by his parents, someone from their social class, someone who would help preserve their family's standing in Valencia's aristocratic circles. But Antonio loved me, and I loved him. For 3 years we met in secret. He would visit the small apartment I shared with my sister, and we would talk about traveling to America together, about building a life where our backgrounds wouldn't matter. The necklace was his promise to me, 8 pink diamonds that he said represented the 8 seasons we would spend together before we could be married. Then the political situation in Spain changed everything. Antonio's family was connected to the old regime, and when Franco's opponents began gaining power, they decided to leave the country. But they weren't planning to take me with them. Antonio was given a choice: abandon his relationship with me and maintain his family's protection, or stay in Spain and risk everything for a love his parents would never accept. He chose his family. I never blamed him for that choice, Rebecca. Sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the world's expectations about who belongs with whom. The night before he left, Antonio came to my apartment one last time. He gave me the necklace and told me to sell it if I ever needed money for passage to America. He said the diamonds would buy me a new life, a better life than anything he could offer me in Spain. But I never sold it. Not when I was struggling to save money for my journey to America. Not when your mother needed college tuition. Not when times were hardest and every dollar mattered. I kept it because it reminded me that once, someone had loved me enough to give me something precious, even when he couldn't give me forever. I wore it every Sunday because it made me feel beautiful, but also because it reminded me that I carried something valuable that the world couldn't see or understand. It taught me that worth isn't always visible to people who only know how to judge surfaces. I saved this story for you because I knew that someday you would need to understand what it means to possess something precious while living in a world that underestimates you. I knew that you would be strong enough to carry this knowledge and wise enough to use it well. The necklace is yours now, along with its stories and its secrets. What you choose to do with both is entirely up to you. With all my love and pride, your grandmother Elena. I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring my vision by the final paragraph. My grandmother hadn't just left me a valuable necklace. She had left me a lesson about love, about worth, about the strength that comes from being underestimated by people who think they understand everything. There's more, Mr. Brennan said gently, handing me another document. This appears to be correspondence between your grandmother and the original jeweler's family in Spain. The second document was a letter in Spanish, dated 1995, with a certified translation attached. It was from someone named Carlos Vega, writing from Valencia. Dear Mrs. Martinez, my grandfather, Alejandro Vega, passed away last month, and while settling his estate, we discovered detailed records of all the pieces he created during his career. Among these records was documentation for a necklace commissioned by Antonio Mendoza in 1928, a piece featuring 8 natural pink diamonds set in a platinum mounting. My grandfather's notes indicate that this piece was never paid for in full before the Mendoza family left Spain. Under normal circumstances, the jewelry would have been reclaimed by our family's business. However, my grandfather's records also indicate that the necklace was a gift of love, and he believed it should remain with the woman it was intended for. I am writing to inform you that our family has no claim on this piece. It belongs to you rightfully and completely. Additionally, I want you to know that my grandfather considered it one of his finest works, and we are honored that it remains with someone who clearly treasures it. Should you ever wish to sell the necklace, please contact our family first. We would be interested in purchasing it back for our private collection, and we would be willing to pay significantly above market value to ensure that such an important piece remains within our family's artistic legacy. With respect and admiration, Carlos Vega Family Jewelers, Valencia. Mr. Brennan handed me one final document, a business card paper-clipped to a handwritten note from my grandmother. The business card was for Carlos Vega, and it included contact information for the Valencia jewelry business that was apparently still operating nearly 70 years after creating my necklace. My grandmother's note was brief. If Rebecca ever wants to know more about Antonio or about why this necklace mattered so much, Carlos Vega has agreed to share what his family remembers. I sat in that law office for another hour, absorbing the full scope of what I had inherited. Not just a valuable necklace, but a love story that had spanned decades and an ocean. Not just rare diamonds, but a family history that my grandmother had carefully preserved and strategically revealed. Most importantly, I had inherited proof that my grandmother had always known exactly what she possessed, and had chosen to let the world underestimate her rather than correct their assumptions. As I drove back to my apartment that afternoon, I thought about Margaret Thornton's suggestion that my necklace was inappropriate for a charity gala. I thought about Janet's concerns about my professional presentation. I thought about Derek and Amanda's dismissive comments about costume jewelry and people who didn't understand social expectations. None of them had bothered to look beyond surfaces. None of them had considered that their assumptions might be wrong. None of them had imagined that the woman they were so eager to educate might be carrying something they would never be able to afford. But now I had more than just knowledge about the necklace's value. I had documentation, certification, and historical proof of its significance. I had my grandmother's love story and her lesson about the power of being underestimated. Most importantly, I had a choice to make about what to do with all of this information. That evening, I spread all the documents across my dining table: the appraisal certificates, my grandmother's letter, the correspondence from the Vega family, and the notebook where I had been recording every slight and assumption from my colleagues over the past month. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Margaret Thornton's office. According to the Henderson & Associates website, the firm would be hosting another charity event in December, the annual Winter Gala benefiting the Boston Symphony Orchestra. As one of their most promising analysts, I would undoubtedly be expected to attend. I thought about walking into that ballroom wearing my grandmother's necklace again, carrying the appraisal certificates in my purse, armed with the full knowledge of what I possessed and what my colleagues had revealed about themselves. But first, I needed to do a little more research. I needed to understand exactly how to make the biggest impact when I finally decided to break my silence. The game was about to change, and this time, I would be the one setting the rules. November passed in a careful dance of observation and preparation. While my colleagues continued treating me as someone whose judgment was questionable and whose presence was barely tolerable, I began building something they never saw coming: a network of allies who understood exactly what was happening at Henderson & Associates. The first unexpected alliance came from Maria Santos, the receptionist whose polite distance I had noticed after the charity gala. Maria had worked at the firm for 8 years, long enough to observe patterns in how different employees were treated, long enough to recognize when someone was being quietly pushed aside. It started with small gestures, a particularly warm smile when I arrived in the morning, a heads up when Janet was in a bad mood, a casual comment about how certain people in the office thought they were better than everyone else. But the real conversation happened on a Friday afternoon when most of the senior staff had left early for a weekend conference in New York. "Rebecca," Maria said, approaching my desk just before 5 o'clock, "do you have a few minutes? I wanted to talk to you about something." I saved my work and followed her to the small break room on the opposite side of the floor. Maria glanced around to make sure we were alone before speaking. "I've been watching what's been happening to you since that charity event," she said quietly. "The way they've been treating you, the way they've been talking about you when you're not around, it's not right." I waited for her to continue, sensing that she had more to say. "I've worked here long enough to see this pattern before," Maria continued. "They find reasons to exclude people who don't fit their idea of what belongs in their world. Last year it was Michael Torres from accounting. They decided his accent was distracting during client calls. 3 years ago it was Jennifer Walsh. Apparently her wardrobe choices were inconsistent with firm standards." Maria's voice carried the weight of someone who had observed years of subtle discrimination disguised as professional feedback. "The thing is, your work has always been excellent. Your clients like you. You've never had any real performance issues. But you wore the wrong necklace to the wrong event, and now suddenly you need professional coaching?" She shook her head. "Rebecca, they're trying to make you feel like you're the problem, so you'll either conform completely to their expectations or leave on your own. Either way, they get what they want without having to take responsibility for their own bias." I felt a surge of gratitude toward Maria, not just for her honesty but for confirming what I had suspected. "Have you seen this happen to other people?" "More often than you'd think," she said. "The difference is, most people either fight back immediately, which gives them an excuse to call you difficult, or they leave quietly. You're doing something different. You're documenting everything, aren't you?" I was surprised by her perceptiveness. "What makes you say that?" Maria smiled. "Because you've been asking very specific questions in meetings. Getting people to repeat their feedback in writing. Creating a paper trail. Either you're planning a lawsuit, or you're planning something else entirely." She was right, though I hadn't been consciously aware of how strategic my behavior had become. "I'm planning something," I admitted. "But not a lawsuit." "Good," Maria said, "because I have some information that might help you." She reached into her purse and withdrew a small digital recorder. "I've been documenting things too, not just about you, but about the way this place really operates when they think nobody's paying attention." Over the next 30 minutes, Maria played me several audio recordings she had made over the past month. Her desk was positioned near the main corridor, and she had overheard and recorded numerous conversations about me that were far more damaging than anything I had witnessed directly. In one recording, I heard Janet talking to Robert Kingsley, the wealthy client we had lunched with in October. "We're working on Rebecca's presentation skills," Janet was saying. "Sometimes employees from less privileged backgrounds need additional coaching to understand the nuances of client relations." Less privileged backgrounds. Janet had made assumptions about my family's economic status, my education, my entire life history based on one evening and one piece of jewelry she had deemed inappropriate. Another recording captured a conversation between Derek and Amanda that was even more revealing. "I heard she grew up in some working-class neighborhood in Somerville," Derek was saying. "Her grandmother was a cleaning lady or something. It explains a lot about why she doesn't get the social expectations." "At least she's trying," Amanda replied. "Janet set her up with that image consultant. Maybe she'll learn how to dress appropriately for client events." "I just feel bad for her," Derek continued. "She's obviously trying to fit in, but she doesn't understand that wearing your grandmother's costume jewelry to the Fairmont makes everyone uncomfortable. It's like showing up to a black tie event in a prom dress." Listening to these conversations was surreal. My colleagues had constructed an entire narrative about my background, my family, and my understanding of professional norms, based on nothing more than their assumptions about what kind of person would wear cheap jewelry to an expensive event. The most damaging recording was from just 3 days earlier, featuring a conversation between Janet and Lisa Park about my future at the firm. "I think we need to be realistic about Rebecca's trajectory here," Janet was saying. "She's technically competent, but she lacks the sophistication our clients expect." The Morrison account situation was embarrassing for everyone involved. "So what are you thinking?" Lisa asked. "Probably a lateral move to our back-office operations," Janet replied. "She'd be happier somewhere where client interaction isn't required. Less pressure, more appropriate for her skill set. Back-office operations. They were planning to move me to a role where I would be invisible, where my presence wouldn't risk embarrassing the firm in front of their sophisticated clients." "Maria," I said after she finished playing the recordings, "why are you sharing this with me?" "Because I've watched too many good people get pushed out of here for stupid reasons," she said. "And because I have a feeling you're not going to let them get away with it this time." She was right. But my response wasn't going to be what anyone expected. That weekend, I made several important decisions. First, I contacted Mrs. Whitmore and arranged for her to prepare additional documentation about my grandmother's necklace, not just the appraisal, but historical research about its provenance and significance. Second, I researched the guest list for the December Winter Gala, identifying key attendees and their connections to the Boston social scene. Most importantly, I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year, Rachel Morrison, a journalist who covered Boston's business and society scene for the Globe. Rachel and I had met at a networking event for young professionals, and she had mentioned that she was always interested in stories about class dynamics and social assumptions in Boston's elite circles. "Rebecca," Rachel said when I called her Sunday evening, "I was just thinking about you. How are things at Henderson and Associates?" "Actually," I said, "that's why I'm calling. I have a story that I think might interest you. It's about assumptions, about value, and about what happens when Boston's social elite gets something very, very wrong." Rachel agreed to meet me for coffee the following week. I didn't tell her about the necklace or the appraisal, but I outlined the basic situation, how a piece of inherited jewelry had led to professional consequences and social humiliation based entirely on its perceived lack of value. "That's exactly the kind of story our readers love," Rachel said. "The intersection of class, perception, and social justice. But I'd need documentation, sources, evidence that what you're describing actually happened." "I have all of that," I told her. "But I want to wait for the right moment to share it." "What are you waiting for?" I smiled, thinking about the December Gala, about the guest list that would include Margaret Thornton and many of the same people who had witnessed my humiliation in October. "I'm waiting for them to do it again." Meanwhile, my strategy at work evolved. Instead of being defensive about the professional development suggestions, I embraced them publicly while privately building my case. I scheduled the appointment with Eleanor Hartwell, the image consultant, and attended our first session with apparent enthusiasm. Eleanor's office was located in a sleek building in the financial district, and her consultation room looked like something from a high-end fashion magazine. She was exactly what I had expected, impeccably dressed, perfectly coiffed, and utterly confident in her ability to transform me into someone more appropriate for my firm's expectations. "Rebecca," she said, reviewing the notes Janet had provided about my, quote, presentation challenges, "I understand you had some difficulties at a recent charity event. Don't worry, these situations are more common than you might think. Many talented professionals struggle with the nuances of high-end social events." She walked me through her assessment process, evaluating everything from my posture to my handshake to my choice of accessories. "The key," she explained, "is understanding that in these environments, everything communicates. Your clothing, your jewelry, your confidence level. It all sends messages about your background, your judgment, your fit within elite social circles." What Eleanor didn't realize was that I was studying her as much as she was studying me. I was learning about the world that had judged me, understanding the rules and expectations that my colleagues considered self-evident but had never bothered to explain. "Now about jewelry," Eleanor continued, pulling out a portfolio of photographs showing appropriate and inappropriate choices for various professional settings. "The goal is always elegance and understatement. Nothing that draws attention, nothing that makes people question your judgment." She showed me examples of what she considered ideal accessories: simple pearl necklaces, small diamond stud earrings, classic gold watches. Everything was expensive but understated, valuable but not flashy, designed to signal wealth and status without appearing to try too hard. "The piece you wore to the charity gala, Eleanor said carefully. "While I'm sure it has sentimental value, sent the wrong message. It appeared." She paused, searching for diplomatic language. "It appeared to be costume jewelry, which suggests either financial constraints or unfamiliarity with appropriate professional standards." I nodded thoughtfully. "So the issue wasn't the style of the necklace, but its perceived value?" "Exactly," Eleanor said, pleased that I seemed to understand. "In environments like the Fairmont Gala, people expect to see authentic pieces. When someone wears what appears to be fake jewelry, it raises questions about their background, their priorities, their understanding of the event's significance." Perfect. Eleanor had just confirmed that the entire professional crisis I had experienced was based on the assumption that my grandmother's necklace was worthless. Every consequence, every humiliation, every threat to my career had stemmed from their certainty that they could accurately assess value by appearance alone. "What would you say," I asked carefully, "if you discovered that a piece of jewelry you had dismissed as costume jewelry was actually extremely valuable?" Eleanor laughed. "Well, that would be embarrassing for everyone involved, wouldn't it? But it's also unlikely. People who own genuinely valuable jewelry usually know what they have, and they certainly know how to present it appropriately." Another perfect response. According to Eleanor's logic, not only was my necklace assumed to be worthless, but my failure to present it appropriately proved that I couldn't possibly understand its true value. I left that consultation with a clearer understanding of exactly how wrong my colleagues were and exactly how satisfying it would be when they finally learned the truth. The December Winter Gala was just 3 weeks away. I had already confirmed my attendance, and I had already decided what I would wear. The same navy blue dress from October, the same simple shoes, and my grandmother's necklace. But this time, I would also carry something else, the complete documentation of what that necklace really was, and the full record of how my colleagues had revealed themselves when they thought they were judging me. The Henderson & Associates Annual Winter Gala was held on December 15th at the Boston Harbor Hotel, overlooking the waterfront where ships had once brought immigrants like my grandmother to start new lives in America. The venue was even more elegant than the Fairmont. Crystal chandeliers reflected in floor-to-ceiling windows, marble columns wrapped in winter greenery, and an atmosphere of refined luxury that spoke to old money and established power. I arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, wearing the same navy blue dress I had worn to the October charity event, but this time I carried something different. A small leather portfolio containing the appraisal certificates, my grandmother's letters, the historical documentation from Valencia, and Maria's audio recordings. Everything was organized in clear protective sleeves, professionally bound, ready to tell a story that would redefine how everyone in that room understood value, judgment, and assumptions. And of course, I wore my grandmother's necklace. The reaction was immediate and exactly what I had expected. As I checked my coat and entered the cocktail reception, I watched faces change as people noticed the familiar necklace. Margaret Thornton spotted me from across the room and actually stopped mid-conversation, her expression shifting from surprise to barely concealed dismay. Janet Morrison appeared at my side within minutes, her smile tight and professional. "Rebecca," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of controlled panic that managers use when an employee is about to embarrass them publicly. "You look lovely, though I have to say I'm surprised by your accessory choice tonight." "My grandmother's necklace," I said innocently. "I thought it was appropriate for the occasion." "After our conversations about professional presentation, I assumed you understood." Janet began, then stopped herself, apparently realizing that criticizing my jewelry choice in front of other guests might not be the best approach. "I understood perfectly," I said. "I understand that you and others made certain assumptions about this necklace based on its appearance. I also understand that those assumptions led to specific consequences for my career and my standing at the firm." Something in my tone must have alerted Janet that this conversation was not going as she expected. "Rebecca, is everything all right? You seem different tonight." "I'm exactly the same as I've always been," I said. "The only thing that's changed is what I know about how people treat someone when they think that person is beneath them." Before Janet could respond, Derek Williams and Amanda Rodriguez joined our conversation, drawn by what was clearly becoming a tense interaction. Derek's eyes immediately went to my necklace, and I saw him exchange a meaningful glance with Amanda. "Becca," Derek said, attempting to inject some lightness into the conversation, "that's the same necklace from the Thornton event, isn't it? I thought Janet mentioned you were working with an image consultant?" "I am working with Eleanor Hartwell," I confirmed. "She's been very educational. She explained to me that in elite social circles, people make judgments about others based on the perceived value of their accessories. She told me that wearing what appears to be fake jewelry suggests either financial constraints or unfamiliarity with appropriate professional standards." Amanda nodded, apparently thinking I was agreeing with their assessment. "Exactly. It's about understanding the message your choices send to clients and colleagues." "The message," I repeated slowly. "Yes, I've been thinking a lot about messages lately. About what people reveal when they make assumptions. About what it means when educated professionals judge someone's worth based on their perception of a piece of jewelry." Lisa Park appeared in our growing circle, clearly drawn by the tension in our conversation. "Is there some kind of problem here?" she asked. "Not a problem," I said. "Actually, I wanted to thank all of you for teaching me so much over the past 2 months. About your values, your judgment, your understanding of worth and appropriateness." I reached into my small evening bag and withdrew the leather portfolio. In fact, I've learned so much that I thought I should share some of what I've discovered. The circle around me had grown to include several other colleagues and even a few clients, who had been drawn by what was clearly becoming an unusual conversation for a charity gala. I could see Margaret Thornton making her way across the room, her expression suggesting she was preparing to manage whatever crisis was developing. "This necklace," I said, touching the stones that caught the light from the chandeliers above us, "has been quite educational. It's taught me about assumptions, about the difference between surface judgments and actual knowledge, about what happens when people who consider themselves sophisticated make decisions based on incomplete information." I opened the portfolio and withdrew the formal appraisal certificate. "For instance, I learned that sometimes what appears to be costume jewelry is actually something quite different." Janet's face went pale as she read the letterhead, "Whitmore and Associates, Certified Gemological Appraisal." Her eyes moved down the page, and I watched her expression change as she processed the technical descriptions and, finally, the bottom line. "This can't be right," she whispered. $485,000 fair market value," I said loud enough for everyone in our circle to hear. 8 rare pink diamonds, set in platinum by master jeweler Alejandro Vega in Valencia, Spain in 1928. Replacement value of $650,000. The silence that followed was profound. Derek actually took a step backward, as if the necklace might burn him. Amanda's face had gone completely white. Lisa Parks stared at the certificate as if it were written in a foreign language. "But you said," Derek began, then stopped. "I never said anything about the necklace's value," I corrected gently. "You all assumed it was worthless, and I never corrected those assumptions. Just like my grandmother never corrected people's assumptions about her when she wore this necklace to clean office buildings for 30 years. Margaret Thornton arrived just in time to hear my last statement. "What's going on here?" she demanded, clearly sensing that something had gone very wrong with what should have been a routine social gathering. "Mrs. Thornton," I said, turning to face her with a smile that I'm sure looked as dangerous as it felt. "I wanted to thank you for your advice at the October charity gala. You suggested that my accessories were distracting from the cause we were there to support." I handed her a copy of the appraisal certificate. "I thought you might be interested to know exactly how distracting a $500,000 necklace can be when people assume it's costume jewelry." Margaret's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Her face flushed red, then went pale, then flushed again as she processed the implications of what she was reading. Around us, conversations had stopped as other guests realized something significant was happening. "There's more," I continued, withdrawing additional documents from my portfolio. "I also learned about the historical significance of this piece. It was commissioned as a gift of love by Antonio Mendoza, heir to one of Valencia's oldest textile fortunes, for my grandmother Elena Martinez in 1928. I shared the letter from Carlos Vega, the documentation of the necklace's provenance, And finally, my grandmother's own words about why she had chosen to let people underestimate her rather than correct their assumptions. "You see," I said, addressing the growing crowd of colleagues and clients who had gathered around us, my grandmother understood something that took me much longer to learn. She understood that sometimes the most valuable things we possess are the ones other people try to convince us are worthless. I withdrew the final item from my portfolio, a transcript of the audio recordings Maria had made, featuring direct quotes from Janet, Derek, Amanda, and others about my background, my judgment, and my fitness for the firm. "For example," I said, reading from the transcript, "Janet Morrison told Robert Kingsley that employees from less privileged backgrounds need additional coaching to understand client relations. Derek Williams told Amanda Rodriguez that people from working-class neighborhoods don't understand social expectations." Eleanor Hartwell, the image consultant the firm hired to fix my presentation problems, explained that wearing apparent costume jewelry suggests financial constraints or unfamiliarity with professional standards. The crowd around us had grown larger, and I could see people taking out their phones, recording what was clearly becoming a dramatic confrontation. Several local business leaders and society figures were in attendance, and they were witnessing the complete dismantling of Henderson and Associates' reputation for sophisticated judgment. "The fascinating thing," I continued, "is that every single assumption you made about me, about my background, about my understanding of value and appropriateness, was wrong. Not just wrong, spectacularly wrong." Janet tried to interrupt. "Rebecca, I think there's been some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," I said firmly. "You treated me as someone who needed education about professional presentation because you assumed my grandmother's necklace was cheap. You questioned my judgment, excluded me from important projects, and planned to move me to back-office operations because you were confident that someone wearing, quote, costume jewelry to a charity gala didn't understand your sophisticated world." I gestured around the room, where dozens of people were now listening intently. "But what you actually revealed was your own inability to recognize value when you saw it. What you demonstrated was that your judgment was based on surfaces, assumptions, and prejudices, rather than knowledge or expertise." Margaret Thornton found her voice. "This is highly inappropriate behavior for a professional event." "What's inappropriate," I interrupted, "is humiliating someone for wearing a family heirloom worth nearly $500,000 because you assumed it was worthless. What's inappropriate is threatening someone's career because you can't distinguish between rare pink diamonds and glass." I closed the portfolio and looked around at the faces surrounding me, some shocked, some embarrassed, some clearly calculating how this revelation would affect their own standing in Boston's business community. "I want to thank all of you," I said, "for teaching me something my grandmother tried to tell me years ago. She said that real value isn't always visible to people who only know how to see surfaces. You proved her right in ways she probably never imagined." The aftermath was swift and decisive. By the following Monday, news of the Winter Gala confrontation had spread throughout Boston's business community. Rachel Morrison's article in the Globe, titled "The $500,000 Lesson When Boston's Elite Got It Wrong," was picked up by national business publications and social media. The article detailed not just the necklace's true value, but the pattern of assumptions and professional consequences I had faced based on its perceived worthlessness. Maria had provided her audio recordings as evidence, and several other Henderson and Associates employees came forward with their own experiences of subtle discrimination and bias. Janet Morrison was quietly asked to resign within a week. Derek Williams and Amanda Rodriguez were reassigned to different departments. Margaret Thornton stepped down from her position on the charity's board after facing intense criticism for her treatment of a donor. Henderson and Associates offered me a significant promotion and a public apology, but I declined both. Instead, I accepted a position at Whitmore and Associates as a director of estate jewelry authentication and appraisal. Mrs. Whitmore had offered me the role after witnessing how I handled the revelation, saying that someone who understood both the technical and emotional value of inherited pieces would be invaluable to families navigating similar discoveries. 6 months later, I launched my own consulting firm specializing in helping people understand and document the value of inherited family pieces. My first client was a woman whose Victorian brooch had been dismissed by relatives as old-fashioned junk, until my appraisal revealed it contained rare Burmese rubies worth over $200,000. I still wear my grandmother's necklace regularly, but now I understand its true power. It's not just worth $485,000 because of the rare pink diamonds. It's worth more than money because it taught me that the most valuable thing you can possess is the strength to be underestimated by people who think they know everything. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people reveal exactly who they are when they think no one important is watching. And sometimes the best revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's proving that their opinions were never worth having in the first place. My grandmother was right about everything. The necklace did have stories. And the most important story it told was about the difference between real value and the shallow judgments of people who mistake price tags for worth. Today, when I work with families who've inherited pieces they don't understand, I always tell them the same thing my grandmother told me. Real value isn't always visible to people who only know how to see surfaces. But that doesn't make it any less real. The necklace still sits in my jewelry box most days, but now it sits there with insurance documentation worth $650,000, and the knowledge that it changed everything. Not just my career, but my understanding of what it means to carry something precious in a world full of people who think they know what they're looking at. They called it costume jewelry, they called it inappropriate, they called it a distraction from more important things. They were wrong about everything. And now the whole world knows it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.